And The Deer Hunter was the first film to show that an epic could be made about Vietnam, and it was followed in less than a year by a second epic by Francis Ford Coppola called Apocalypse Now. It provided a rival portrait that faced the realities of Vietnam much more squarely than The Deer Hunter. It was an adaptation of a short novel by Joseph Conrad called The Heart of Darkness, moved from the Belgian Congo into Southeast Asia. Now, the central plot of Apocalypse Now was as fictional and far-fetched as The Deer Hunter, but it did portray some of the stresses of war more accurately. In a sequence some critics hailed as the most thrilling battle scene ever filmed, Colonel Kilgore leads a helicopter assault nearly as ruthless as the one at My Lai. If we could have our videotape, please, let's see a glimpse of this scene. We can cut right there. The assault seems almost surreal because the choppers descend on their target while loudspeakers are blasting Wagnerian opera. The resemblances, however, to My Lai seem inescapable. Playing cards of death are left on the bodies of slain villagers as warnings to the Viet Cong. Yet audiences may have been so swept away by the sheer power of the chopper assault that many Americans embraced the affirmation of American technological supremacy. In a chilling example of life imitating art, some American assault helicopters in the Gulf War attacked Iraqi positions as loudspeakers boomed out recordings of Wagner. Many Americans were reluctant to examine the brutality of My Lai. It was simpler to embrace the traditional myths of American valor, American honor, American decency. Ronald Reagan would call on Americans to stand tall, and he praised the war in Vietnam as a noble cause. Reagan's views were in tune with a number of films that defended the American role in Vietnam. Two of the most popular films of the Reagan years, the 1980s, starred Sylvester Stallone as the smoldering half-Indian, half-German John Rambo. In First Blood, Rambo is a damaged and deranged Vietnam War vet. But underneath the anti-social shell lurks a noble savage. When Rambo is challenged by the sadistic sheriff of a corrupt town in the Pacific Northwest, he undertakes a private war against the establishment, leaves the town in ruins. In this Hollywood revenge fantasy, the innocent warrior vents his rage against the weak-kneed politicians and bureaucrats who refuse to let him fight to win in Vietnam. If we could see a clip from Rambo. Okay, let's see if we can get this clip. Oh.
It's over, Johnny. It's over. Nothing is over! Nothing! You just don't turn it off! It wasn't my war! You asked me, I didn't ask you! And I did what I had to do to win, but somebody wouldn't let us win! And I come back to the world, and I see all those maggots at the airport protesting me, spitting, calling me baby killer and all kinds of vile crap! Who are they to protest me, huh? Who are they? Unless they've been me and been there and know what the hell they're yelling about.
It was a bad time for everyone, Rambo. It's all in the past now.
For you! For me, civilian life is nothing. In the field, we had a code of honor. You watch my back, I watch yours. Back here, there's nothing.
You're the
Let's
last in the
cut
elite
right
group.
there. There you see a very different version of the Vietnam War than the version portrayed in Deer Hunter or in Apocalypse Now. In First Blood Part 2, 1985, 2 years after this scene was filmed, a special operations unit from Washington wants to send Rambo back into Vietnam to discover whether Americans listed as missing in action are still being held as prisoner. Rambo locates a missing in action prison camp with the help of an Asian beauty he encounters. But treachery is afoot. When Rambo radios in the camp's location, the stinking bureaucrat from Special Operations calls back the rescue helicopter. He had assumed that Rambo would fail, thus allowing the controversy over missing in actions to disappear. Needless to say, Rambo manages to fight off entire detachments of Vietnamese and their Russian allies, rescuing the American prisoners and piloting them safely back home. Now, how does a film's plot reflect a mythic reality rather than a historical reality? To begin with, the plot is not about the war itself. In an escapist adventure, Rambo must be allowed to win. And even in Hollywood, where producers rewrite history to their own taste, there was no way in which you could rewrite the Vietnam War as an American victory. By focusing instead on the issue of prisoners of war, victory was defined in a much simpler way, as rescuing a dozen prisoners. And like the Deer Hunter, the film's motivation centers on what they did to us, rather than on the much more ambiguous question of what we did to them. Furthermore, the mythical Green Berets of the 1960s are now transformed. In 1968, when real lives were being lost and real atrocities were being committed, the Green Berets were careful to show John Wayne restraining his bloodthirsty Vietnamese allies. By the 1980s, however, Rambo's new version of valor is a muscular Superman whose body becomes a finely tuned killing machine. During the years when the war was actually fought, Stallone himself was spending his draft years teaching at a private girls' school in Switzerland and acting in porn films titled A Party at Kitty and Studs. By the 1980s, the villains had changed also. The Vietnamese still conform to the Hollywood stereotypes of Asian soldiers. They shout around a lot and run around ineffectively. But Stallone's real opponent in Rambo becomes a blonde Russian sadist. Vietnam had faded from the front pages, but Russia was now the evil empire. Perhaps most revealingly, the climax of the film occurs not when Stallone rescues the missing in action, but when he stomps into American Intelligence Operations Center and machine guns the files, computers, and radio equipment of the quaking traitor from Washington. By the time the last credits roll by, he has not only defeated the Vietnamese and the Russians, but also the greatest villain of Ronald Reagan's domestic evil empire, the government bureaucrat. 1968 would see a very different film about Vietnam. The director of Platoon was Oliver Stone, who had actually served in Vietnam for 15 months and been wounded twice, one of the few Yale graduates to go to Vietnam. Platoon became one of the first commercially successful movies to look at the war itself. Chris Taylor steps out of a cargo plane into the oppressive heat of Vietnam. The sound of jet engines, jeeps, and airport clatter are muted. Over them, a sad melody fills the soundtrack. The music is Samuel Barber's Adagio for Strings, a composition that was broadcast following the death of Franklin Roosevelt in 1945. In Platoon, this Barber piece mourns men and times past. As Taylor and other GIs cross the runway, they see body bags of dead servicemen being loaded into the plane heading home. At the outset, Platoon's format seems much like the old World War II dramas. You have an ethnically balanced mix of soldiers learning the hard lessons of war. But this is Vietnam, and Platoon recognizes the difference. We meet Bunny, the violent redneck who takes bites out of beer cans. Ra, the tough-minded Puerto Rican. King, a black draftee from the hills of Tennessee. Lerner, a native white recruit. Junior, a street-smart black soldier from the urban north. And Chris Taylor, the college-educated odd man who has volunteered for military service. What Platoon dramatizes is the anguish of fighting in Vietnam. Charlie Sheen is tormented by ants that crawl over his body. He faints from the heat and the humidity of the hard march. He stares anxiously into a rainy, impenetrable dark, trying to spot an invisible enemy. Then, on New Year's Day, 1968, the platoon comes upon an enemy bunker complex. At the center of the jungle camp, a fire still burns. Evidently, the Viet Cong have fled only moments earlier. Sergeant Elias probes a tunnel complex, inching along in the dark, hoping not to be blown away by a waiting guerrilla. Suddenly, a booby trap explodes, killing a soldier. From out of the jungle, the men march to a nearby village. The Viet Cong have retreated here, haven't they? Let's take a peek at the film and see this scene.
Bravo 6 to this, 2. We're rounding up the Victor Charlie suspect from Danny Mall. Bravo 2
Fire in the hole! Fire in the hole!
Okay, we can cut right there. Along the way, another soldier is found brutally murdered. It has left the platoon in a dangerous mood. The villagers are going placidly about their farm work, yet the Americans realize that at the very least, the residents have been helping the guerrillas, and perhaps are Viet Cong themselves. The scar-faced Sergeant Barnes stalks angrily through the settlement. He finds concealed ammunition. He herds some women into a pig pen. A soldier flushes one man from a bunker and, temporarily enraged, shoots at a peasant's feet, making him dance in fear. Then another soldier crushes the man's skull with a rifle butt. Outside, other women and children are crying. The hysteria, the fear, the rage clearly upset the men, who are on the verge of opening fire indiscriminately. Sergeant Barnes shoots one woman who has been yelling at him, then points his rifle at another woman and is about to execute her when Elias physically attacks him and tells him to stop. Barnes backs off, but fixes Elias with a steely eye. "You're dead," he says. The platoon's lieutenant gives the order to torch the village, and then the soldiers move out. That was the scene we saw. What makes the sequence remarkable is that unlike the Green Berets, unlike the Deer Hunter, unlike Rambo, it provides an answer to a question that is at the bottom historical rather than being mythical. What we are seeing is how My Lai could take place. And we see how My Lai was averted because Sergeant Elias stepped in. But because the film has followed the platoon's mission over the course of several months, we see the incident in context. We see the men's rage. We see the men's anxiety. We see their tempers building up before it explodes. Platoon makes it easier to see that in a civil war, where the civilian population is divided, war becomes ambiguous. War becomes a dangerous occupation, especially to the foreigners, the troops, who understand little about Vietnamese culture. In a war where territory is never permanently gained, how could victory be measured? Well, body counts were the answer. Anything that's dead and isn't white is a Viet Cong, went one Army joke. In the end, it will not do to say that Platoon is better history than the Green Berets, although most historians would agree that it more accurately portrays the realities of the war. Myths of the movies will always reflect the needs of drama more than they reflect historical evidence. Now, movies do not simply mirror reality. Movies can also help to construct reality. And in the next portion of our class, we're going to talk about how the movies help to create a vivid reality in Americans' minds. A reality, though apparently not true, seems as real to Americans as anything in life. What we're going to talk about are how the movies helped create the widespread conviction among Americans that there are Americans, prisoners of war, still living in Southeast Asia. There are few more potent images in all of American popular culture than the belief that there are U.S. prisoners left in Vietnam. 69% of all Americans believe that now, 30 years after American troops left, that there are still Americans held hostage in Vietnam. Throughout this nation, particularly in working-class neighborhoods, a black and white prisoner of war missing in action flag often flies alongside the stars and stripes. Bumper stickers, buttons, and T-shirts proclaim American POWs, MIAs are alive in Vietnam. POWs never have a nice day. Millions of Americans have worn POW bracelets. The POWs prove undeniably the cruelty and inhumanity of the Vietnamese communists. They prove the fortitude and the heroism of the American fighting man, and they prove the nobility of the cause for which the United States fought in Indochina. Now, I, myself, do not have any idea at all whether there are any American prisoners of war in Southeast Asia, or if there were some after the war and they were executed. I don't know. But that belief that there was had a profound political, cultural, and psychological influence on American society. And when John McCain ran for the presidency in the year 2000, it gained added resonance because he himself had been an American prisoner of war in Vietnam. So what I'm going to do next is examine how this belief that there are American prisoners of war in Southeast Asia originated, and how it grew, and how it became a basic tenet of American belief. We learned it at the movies. In 1968, Richard Nixon pledged that the first priority of his administration was to bring an honorable end to the war in Vietnam. Yet few people would have imagined that American involvement in Vietnam would last another 5 years. It would not be until 1973 that the last American soldier was brought home. So we might ask a question. How could Richard Nixon sustain the war that had defeated Lyndon Johnson? And the answer is that he would rely on a new issue, the fate of American prisoners of war. The Nixon administration decided from the very beginning to make American prisoners of war a major political issue. 5 days after he was inaugurated in 1969, Nixon's representative introduced this issue at the Paris peace talks with the North Vietnamese. Now, the POW issue would be a powerful counterforce to the anti-war movement. Over 50 million POW bumper stickers were sold over the next 4 years. The Nixon administration charged that at least half of the 1,300 Americans missing in action were alive and being held prisoner. The media spotlighted delegations of wives and parents of missing men who demanded meetings with North Vietnamese negotiators. Ross Perot, you remember him, had 152 wives and children flown to Paris on his own jetliner, laden with Christmas presents for American prisoners of war. In 1970, the State Department and Defense Department helped form the National League of Families of Prisoners in Southeast Asia. In other words, the prisoner of war issue was not simply a grassroots issue. It was an issue that was nurtured and cultivated at the highest levels of the American government. Now, amid these events, another organization was launching an enterprise that would make the POW issue the subject of intense passion among millions of Americans. This was the Victory in Vietnam Association, a student-faculty group that was designed to counteract anti-war sentiment on America's campuses. Members of the Victory in Vietnam Association contributed the idea of selling bracelets, each one engraved with the name of a prisoner of war. By the time American involvement ended, 1973, between 4 and 10 million Americans were wearing bracelets, each one with the name of someone missing in action. Everyone who wore one of those bracelets promised not to remove it until his or her POW was either found to be dead or returned home. In short, millions of adults developed profound emotional ties with men whose names were displayed on their wrists. Now, let's look at what we do know about prisoners of war. When American involvement in the war ended in 1973, Vietnam and Laos accounted for approximately 653 servicemen. 562 were released, and 55 were listed as dead. But this, of course, was only the beginning of the story. In the late 1970s, there began a rewriting and reimagining of the history of the Vietnam War. It created a vision of idealistically heroic Americans courageously battling hordes of sadistic Asian communists. Now, of course, by far the most influential work in this campaign was the film The Deer Hunter, which would receive the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1978. The movie's basic technique was to take images of the war that had been deeply embedded in the American psyche and to transform them into their opposite. For example, in the first scene in Vietnam, a uniformed soldier throws a grenade into an underground shelter harboring women and children, and then with his automatic assault rifle mows down a woman and her baby. The scene, of course, resembles pictures of the My Lai massacre, but in this version, it is a North Vietnamese soldier doing the damage. When two men plummet from a helicopter, the image duplicates a sequence from the war showing a Viet Cong prisoner being pushed from a helicopter to make other prisoners talk. But now the falling men are American POWs. Now, as we saw earlier, the central structuring metaphor for the film is Russian roulette. Sadistic Asian communists force the prisoners to play this game. POW after POW is shown with a revolver at his right temple. This, of course, resembles a sequence seen by tens of millions of Americans in which the chief of the Saigon police placed a revolver to the temple of a Viet Cong prisoner and killed him with a single shot. There's no evidence that American prisoners were forced to play Russian roulette. The Deer Hunter is filled with images of POWs as crucified Christs, bloody headbands replacing Christ's crown of thorns. So the Deer Hunter mixes religious and patriotic messages, and it portrays American white working class men as crucified prisoners of the Vietnamese. Now, the story of heroic American prisoners abandoned in Southeast Asia would become one of the most powerful myths in all of American culture. And the character central to the POW story was a retired Special Forces colonel named Bo Gritz, who would organize a rescue mission into Laos. With devout faith in living POWs abandoned by their government to cruel communist slavery, Bo Gritz conceived their rescue as a mission forced upon him by destiny. Now, why was he the chosen one? Because the only two other men capable of such action, as he put it, were no longer around to do the job. Both Teddy Roosevelt and John Wayne are dead. But two other men of action were available to finance Bo Gritz's mission: Captain Kirk of the Starship Enterprise and Dirty Harry. Bo Gritz would turn to William Shatner and Clint Eastwood to help him rescue America's prisoners of war. Ever since the Paris Peace Agreement of 1973, rumors had spread of a conspiracy high in the U.S. government to deny the existence of American prisoners of war. The villains were government bureaucrats, CIA operatives, and liberal politicians. With the inauguration of Ronald Reagan as president, the myth evolved that Reagan yearned to save the POWs, but was surrounded and kept in ignorance by a group of scheming bureaucrats and liberals. So the question was, who could get by these evil gatekeepers and bring the truth to the president? And that man was Clint Eastwood. On the night of November 27th, 1982, a team of commandos led by Bo Gritz crossed the Mekong River from Thailand into Laos. And simultaneously, Clint Eastwood met with President Ronald Reagan. Reagan himself had been a prisoner of war of Asian communists during the Korean War as star of the 1954 movie Prisoner of War. But Gritz's raid was no Hollywood production. As soon as they arrived in Laos, he and his men were ambushed, routed, and forced to flee back into Thailand. They were routed not by communists, but by a rival anti-communist group in Laos. In the next few months, Colonel Bo Gritz would become a star of magazines, newspapers, radio, and TV. In this culture, failure is never failure. But his story was hardly the tale of spectacularly successful heroism. Hollywood was now given the assignment of showing how the story was supposed to look. Amid the media hoopla about the Beau Grits raid, the first movie version began shooting, and it starred Gene Hackman as a retired Marine colonel. The movie was called Uncommon Valor, and it made it to the screen Christmas 1983. The following year came Missing in Action, with Chuck Norris as a retired Special Forces colonel. And then in 1985, the story attained its apotheosis in Rambo, played by Sylvester Stallone. Uncommon Valor was labeled a mere okay grind actioner by Variety. It was dismissed by most reviewers, whose reactions can be summed up by the headline, "Comic strip level heroism makes Uncommon Valor a common bore." But within a few weeks, critics were startled to comprehend the audience reaction. This movie became the biggest movie surprise of 1983-1984. Clearly, this movie touched a deep nerve. The ads provided the explanation, I think. The war's not over until the last man comes home. The experience of Colonel Jason Rhodes, played by Gene Hackman, helped create that myth that became a key part of American culture. Rhodes' son had been missing in action for a decade, since the end of the war. Colonel Rhodes learns that there had been over 400 live sightings of men held against their will in Southeast Asia. Colonel Rhodes becomes convinced that his son is a prisoner in a Laotian camp. After 10 years of being brushed off by government bureaucrats and victimized by con men in Thailand, Rhodes finally learns the truth from an active duty Air Force colonel. The officer pulls from his briefcase a photograph taken by a high-altitude reconnaissance plane. "That's your proof," he declares. "It's a prison camp in Laos." Government cowardice and betrayal could not be built into the mythic structure of Uncommon Valor. Hackman's efforts to recruit and train a team to rescue his son, which takes up more than half of the film, are constantly menaced by politicians and omnipresent government agents equipped with high-tech spy mics, phone taps. These sinister figures also try to intimidate the Texas oil tycoon who finances the Raiders' training camp by threatening an IRS audit of his corporation. Just as Hackman and his team are about to launch their mission from Thailand into Laos, U.S. agents have them apprehended by Thai authorities. The authorities then confiscate their weapons and force them to rely on a Bangkok gun dealer and an aged Laotian drug runner. To recruit his team of rescuers, Hackman first had to rescue each man from the corrupting, emasculating bonds of civilian life in America, including the domestic bondage imposed by women. Only then could these all-American heroes slaughter hordes of Asians, rescue their enslaved comrades, give the Vietnam War a noble ending, and redeem America. So this image of a nation run by bureaucrats, by politicians, by shadowy secret agents in business suits who have betrayed the true heroes, gives these films their power. The idolism, the virility, the heroism of the men who dedicate their lives to rescuing their abandoned comrades. This image is a counter to the other image of a weak, decadent America, subjugated by materialism, hedonism, and feminism. So what is happening is the POW story is being transformed into a genuine American myth. And it would reach its consummation in a fantasy whose hero's name would become a part of our everyday vocabulary: Rambo. As Rambo packed theaters with audiences who howled with pleasure and wildly cheered every slaying of a Vietnamese or Russian, the nation was flooded with Rambo action dolls, Rambo watches, Rambo walkie-talkies, Rambo water guns, Rambo bubble gum, Rambo pinball machines, sportswear for all ages, even Rambo grams, messages delivered by headbanded muscle men sporting bandoliers across their chests. A TV cartoon transformed Rambo into liberty's champion, a Superman who engaged in global struggle against evil. This new American hero was a careful Hollywood construct. And what I want to do next is talk about how Rambo was created. Because Rambo was not created anew. Rather, Rambo was constructed in Hollywood through recycled cultural materials. As you know, there's no recycling like the recycling they do in Hollywood. Rambo's roots tap into the very foundation of American identity, the myth of the frontier. Rambo perpetuates the wartime vision of Vietnam as a vast frontier filled with dangerous savages. But Rambo is not just the Indian fighter. Notice, Rambo is also the Indian. John Rambo is of Indian-German descent, a hell of a combination. So he can represent both soldiers and Indians. He can represent both whites and Indians. But the main models for Rambo come much more directly from American popular culture. Edgar Rice Burroughs, once America's most popular novelist, created two of Rambo's forebears. First, there was John Carter. John Carter was a martial arts expert, a veteran of a defeated American army who fights in alien lands against insurmountable odds. And also, Edgar Rice Burroughs created a bare-chested, muscular He-Man in the tropical jungle who carries out spectacular deeds of heroism, who you all know as Tarzan. Rambo also draws upon the comic book hero who may seem to be an ordinary human being, but really possesses superhuman powers that allow him to fight for truth, justice, and the American way. In other words, Rambo personifies national fantasies. When we first see Rambo, he's performing slave labor. He's breaking rocks in a desolate prison as punishment for his rebellion against the brutal lawmen in 1982's First Blood. When his former commanding officer offers him freedom in exchange for undertaking a mission in Vietnam, Rambo replies, "Do we get to win this time?" Resonating in the question is the notion that we could have won the war if only the politicians, the media, the liberal establishment, bureaucrats, draft-dodging students and their pinko professors, hippies, wimps, bleeding heart housewives, and Jane Fonda hadn't tied the boys' hands and stabbed them in the back. In other words, in Rambo, the real enemy is personified as the archetypical bureaucrat, the perfidious, gutless, seemingly impotent Marshall Murdoch. Accused of being a stinking bureaucrat that's trying to cover his ass, Murdoch, who explicitly represents Washington, replies, "Not just mine, a nation's." Rambo is advised, "Let technology do most of the work," referring to Murdoch's wondrous computer complex and high-tech weaponry. But Murdoch uses his machines, he deploys his underlings to sabotage Rambo's mission. The climax of First Blood comes after Rambo returns with the POWs he has rescued, when he proceeds to blast Murdoch's computers with automatic weapon fire and then uses his gigantic knife to subjugate the whining, quivering, wimpy traitor. The cultural products that disseminate the story of the prisoners of war have tended increasingly to project a vast government cover-up and conspiracy to disguise from the American people the real truth of what was going on in Vietnam. In the 1989 TV movie, The Forgotten, high government officials actually conspire to psychologically torture and assassinate prisoners of war so that they won't reveal that these officials had colluded with North Vietnam to sabotage a rescue mission. The hero of Jack Buchanan's 15 MIA Hunter novels constantly battles against Washington and its sinister operatives. In MIA Hunter, Cambodian hellhole, he can pursue his quest only after demolishing a CIA hit team sent to arrest him. Meanwhile, Rambo was having an influence on the government itself. No post-war White House spokesman actually claimed that American prisoners were still being held in Vietnam until October 1985, when Rambo was packing the theaters. The assertion that there have to be live Americans there was made by President Reagan's National Security Advisor. But just as in the movie, Rambo proves difficult for the government to control once he is unleashed, so too was the POW story. In December 1985, 60 Minutes aired a segment on the POW issue titled dead or alive. The show was designed to present two sides of the issue. One side was the official Reagan administration point of view, that there might be American prisoners held captive in Southeast Asia. And what was the other side of the story on 60 Minutes? That live POWs were a myth? No. That the government itself was engaged in a vast conspiracy to conceal its own certain knowledge of the existence of dozens of live POWs. In the 40s and 50s, war films, you'll recall, emphasized patriotism, they emphasized group effort, and they emphasized the value of sacrifice for a larger cause. But the movies made about Vietnam tell us a very different story about the meaning of war. They tell us about the exploits of one-man armies, of bold fighter pilots, of vigilantes armed to the teeth. Real war lays bare the poverty of Hollywood's war fantasies. Real wars bear very little resemblance to what we typically see in the movies. Real wars are a source of dread and apprehension. Wars are not a source of excitement and suspense. During the Gulf War, for weeks on end, all Americans felt unbroken anxiety. And no war movie, I think, has ever been able to convey that anxiety that people feel. Hollywood's fantasies either reduce the enemy to stereotypes or else they reduce the enemy to inscrutability. People in war movies talk tough. In real life, people express fear and trepidation. Real-life images of gas-masked reporters were much more frightening than any special effects that Hollywood ever produced. Now, it would take the United States until 1982 to erect a monument to the men who fought in Vietnam. But it would take even longer for Hollywood to find a way to transform political passions into entertainment. And that's what we want to talk about next. It would not be until the late 1980s, after a long period of silence, that Vietnam truly received the Hollywood treatment. During the war itself, a single major film dealt with the war. Remember the Green Berets, John Wayne. The first scenes of Vietnam were of deranged Vietnam vets, like Travis Bickle we saw before. Then, beginning in the late 70s, the first war movies appeared. Apocalypse Now, Go Tell the Spartans, Coming Home, The Boys in Company C. And suddenly, film reviewers began to speak about the quote-unquote maturing of the American audience, an audience supposedly ready for brutally frank images of how the war was really fought. But Vietnam films did not show the war the way it really was. What the films did is they depoliticized the war. They transformed the war from a political or military conflict into a psychological conflict. They transformed the story of Vietnam into an emotional drama of Americans struggling for survival, not so much against the Vietnamese as against the American bureaucracy. Just as the Vietnam Memorial allowed the public to mourn lost American lives without coming to terms with the war, so too Vietnam movies focus on the emotional and psychological legacy of the war without confronting any of the political issues that the war raised. When Americans first became conscious of the Vietnam War in 1964 and 1965, the country's mood, the country's assumptions were very different from what they are now. America seemed to be omnipotent then. The country could still claim it had never lost a war. We believed that we were ordained to play cop to the communist robbers. Our national myth showed us that we were good, that our technology made us strong, that our bureaucracy was a source of strength. The Vietnam War stripped the nation of its self-image as the lone ranger of international affairs. The good neighbor war cop, a cowboy tall in the saddle against a world teeming with sneaky Indians. The war bitterly divided social groups, bitterly divided generations, and out of its unrest came a deepening cynicism towards government. So, let's see how Hollywood has dealt with the war. Now, the plots of individual movies vary quite widely. In Oliver Stone's Platoon, a Yale dropout joins a platoon in which a bleak killer and a dope-smoking saint vie for his soul. In Good Morning Vietnam, the Disney version of the Vietnam War, Army disc jockey Adrian Conauer pokes fun at official stuffed shirts. Brian De Palma's Casualties of War recounts the rape and murder of a Vietnamese farm girl by a battle-crazed squad. Yet for all their differences, there is a basic similarity to all these movies. They all share a generic plot. All tell the story of what we might call the innocent, naive, noble American grunt. Now, what is the generic Vietnam War plot? It features combat units and then charts their gradual deterioration and disintegration. They chart the breakdown of idealism. They chart the breakdown of order. They chart the breakdown of cohesion. They chart the alienation of the soldiers and those at home. And finally, they chart the loss of everything but the will to survive. What these movies do is they celebrate survival as heroism. They celebrate cynicism as a form of self-preservation. So what the generic Vietnam War film does is it recasts the war as a test of physical and psychic survival. The soldier is left without authority and must make his way himself through the moral jungle of Vietnam. Now, in these generic war films, the war is seen from the perspective, the point of view of American soldiers in barracks and in bars, in jungles, and in rice paddies. And so, in other words, the war is largely confined to the years in which ground troops are present. And in these movies, the enemy is not so much the Viet Cong. The enemy is the military bureaucracy. So in these films, you see characters who are misunderstood, confused, idealistic, well-intentioned, and they are invariably betrayed from above. Now, these films say nothing about the purpose of the war. They say nothing about the moral meaning of the war. They say nothing about the war's unhappy conclusion. What the films do say is that the soldiers have been betrayed not only by their superiors, but also by macho warrior values that make it impossible for them to express their emotions openly. Now, these films are about the Vietnam War, but what's curious about them is that Vietnamese people have little place in these wars. Vietnamese characters are only important as triggers for questions of conscience and questions of responsibility for Americans. That is because political issues are inconsequential in these films. Insofar as the Vietnamese do appear, they are held up simply as true warriors who have a real sense of purpose and a real sense of community, unlike Americans. In contrast, Americans have no sense of community and no sense of purpose. So the Vietnamese become part of the backdrop of paranoia into which the American innocent has been lowered. So the Vietnamese in these films are treated as sneaky figures who rustle ominously in the distance, laying booby traps. And the allegiance of individual Vietnamese is never clear or certain. Sometimes, however, the Vietnamese are treated in another way, and that is as victims. In Platoon, tension and paranoia result in a My Lai-type massacre of civilians. So the Vietnamese are never treated as agents. They're never treated as actors. They're treated as merely invisible or inscrutable or as victims. The Vietnam War films are inaccurate in another way. The air war is invisible. The bombers are absent. Bomb craters are rarely seen. Talk to anyone who fought in Vietnam and they'll tell you that there was a constant din of noise as you heard the B-52s always overhead. You don't hear that in these movies. Defoliation, Agent Orange, is not much in evidence either. And there's a good reason for this, and the reason is this. My basic argument is that the Vietnam War film is not really about Vietnam, and it's not really about the war. It's about the individual's struggle to maintain a sense of humanity in the midst of chaos. It's about each person's struggle to maintain integrity and caring in the midst of total pointlessness. And that's what the Vietnam grunt movie is truly about. The real enemy is not the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong. The real enemy are the higher-ups. So the tone of the Vietnam War film tends to be remarkably cynical. Now, let me add something else here. While these movies talk about higher-ups, they're never too higher up. They're never pointing the finger at anyone in the State Department, let alone anyone in the White House. In Good Morning Vietnam, the bad guy is the man who runs the radio station, who can't see that he needs an able disc jockey to boost troop morale. The grunts may complain about incompetent, arrogant, and corrupt higher-ups, but they don't do anything about it in these movies. Fragging, the deliberate killing of officers by their men, is a rarity in these films. It was far more common in the actual war. In the meantime, the real war makers, called the best and the brightest, they are invisible. So these films treat Vietnam as a murky moral jungle, an unpredictable frontier, seedy with booby traps and time bombs, a jungle that metaphorically overwhelms the grunts. The grunts, in turn, try to find support and solidarity with each other. The movies take place between 1965 and 1968. They totally ignore the origins of America's involvement in Vietnam, and they also ignore the process of Vietnamization with which the war ended. That is, South Vietnamese troops replacing American troops. We need to remember that while 58,000 Americans died during the Vietnam War, between 2 and 3 million Vietnamese also died in the conflict. Vietnam was not only an overseas war, it was also a civil war, which Americans first entered as advisors. It was a war fueled by anti-communist rhetoric. But in the war movies, the Civil War virtually disappears. Differences between North and South Vietnam evaporate in these war films. From the Hollywood point of view, all Vietnamese are inscrutable, and the whole struggle is presumed to be meaningless. The war appears as a chaotic, maddening exercise in tracking an invisible enemy. Now, of course, films are no substitute for good history. You don't go to Vietnam War film to understand the historical process of American involvement in Vietnam. But that doesn't mean that you don't learn things at the movies. The whole theme of our course has been that movies are educators. And I want to suggest to you that when you see a Vietnam War film, you are learning certain influential political lessons and morals. The Vietnam War films express the idea that Vietnam was not a war, but a personal, psychological tragedy. A tragedy that was not political, and a tragedy primarily experienced by American grunts and not by the Vietnamese. Vietnam War films succeeded by transforming the war into the story of wounded innocence, of individual heroics, a story of male bonding. Above all, a story of underdogs battling bungling bureaucrats. And the most extreme example of this pattern can, of course, be found in Rambo. In this film, it is the Americans who become the underdogs and who become the victims. Abandoned by corrupt officers, Rambo assumes the role of guerrilla fighter. He skulks through the rainforest, half naked. He blows up enemies with a bow and arrow, but now armed with explosives. And he always falls back on his hunting knife. In other words, Rambo truly becomes the American as Indian. We are now placed in the position of the Indians, the victims surrounded by forces that are threatening our way of life. In other words, what is remarkable to me about the Vietnam War film is the way it reconstructs the whole mythology of the American Western. Vietnamese in these films are both victims and villains. A Vietnamese woman falls in love with Rambo. Her dream is to go to America. The Vietnamese military is equipped with sophisticated equipment and uses air power against Rambo. They torture Rambo on electric torture apparatus. In other words, roles have been completely inverted. Roles have been completely reversed. The United States is now the victim, and we are struggling for our own survival against people who represent total evil. Next week, in our final class, we will be pulling our course together. We were going to look at movies in the 70s and 80s and 90s up to the present. But here, at the end of this session, let me talk a little bit about an overview of the movies. Movies began with the 20th century. Within 20 years, movies began to rule the American imagination. And movies would rule our imagination more than any older art form, because no art form had ever been so driven by commerce. Now, of course, today, television has much more sway than the movies over people's lives. And it may well be that the internet itself will supplant television. And there's no question that the internet is reinforcing a trend towards isolation and shrinking screen size. Classic Hollywood enjoyed its zenith in lavish palaces owned by film studios. But by the 1950s, homes had their own screens, and the business had lost its theater chains. Reliable genres had been played out, and the star system was replaced by free agency. In an art like movies that is fairly young, each decade is an epic. The 20th century was the movie century. In an art only a century long, each decade has been crucial. Movies began as entertainment for illiterates. Peep shows turned into theaters. Sheets became screens in the first decade of the 20th century. Then in the 1910s, Thomas Edison's attempt at control of the movie industry was broken. Films lengthened. Editing found its tools. Theaters multiplied. The star system and the studio system were born. Then in the 20s, Clara Bow flapped. Douglas Fairbanks bounded. Cecil B. DeMille discovered sex in the Bible. Fatty Arbuckle was ruined. And the talkies arrived with the jazz singer. Then the 30s. Sound finally killed the silent voice. Disney industrialized animation. Astaire and Rogers soared. Cagney and Gable redefined masculinity. And the feminine was polarized by Greta Garbo, Bette Davis. Hitchcock codified suspense. John Ford defined the Western. The studio system produced its greatest films. And then the 40s. Hollywood absorbed such emigres as Hitchcock, Fritz Lang, Bertolt Brecht, Jean Renoir, and Billy Wilder. Film noir transformed anxiety into a style. The industry felt the cold winds of the Red Scare and TV. So each decade has brought profound changes to movies. And in our next and final class, we'll carry that story up to the present. Thanks.